Every time we build and ship software, we learn something new. Understanding what worked and what didn't helps us build more confidently the next time around. That's why we're launching the Confident Commit newsletter. We want to help you make better, data-driven decisions. Subscribe today to Win It Software. CircleCI.com/newsletter.
Hello, and welcome to the Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on how to deliver software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader in all things CI and CD. Today, I'm joined by Heidi Helfand, author of Dynamic Reteaming and coach to the stars. Like, what else do I describe as your, well, first of all, thank you for joining me, Heidi. So glad to have you here today. Super excited to talk about the book, about the work that you've been doing, the work that you continue to do. I find it super fascinating. We're going to get into it. But just quickly, a little bit, I mean, I know that you wrote the book. I know you've done some updates and I've seen you speak about it. So, I've seen that in a lot of different contexts, but you've done some of this work inside organizations in the past, but I believe you also do it, as a coach or consultant to as a third party to other organizations. Is that right?
Yeah. People tend to come to me when they want to speed up development or things aren't really going the way we expected. Can you come in and help? So I help with team dynamics and a lot of like technical project management, and other things. But for years, I've been in different startups that have grown bigger as a member of the technical team. So that's really what I love to do. So help people build software.
It's so fascinating because we have this podcast billed as, being better and faster at software delivery. And I think when we started, we had kind of a picture of what that was, but it turns out literally everything is involved in being better at delivering software, right? And delivering software quickly, right? It's like you're talking about team dynamics. Someone might wake up and think we're talking about, the CI pipeline or the tech stack that we've chosen or, setting vision and strategy. Like all of these things have so much impact on our ability to deliver. So I love it because it gets us into this really broad sort of spectrum of topics. Cool. So let's talk about dynamic reteaming, and actually let's just talk about teams for a second. So when you talk about a team in a software engineering organization, what's the kind of boundary of that? Like, how do you think about how teams are comprised? And then I'd love to hear a little bit about what you think good looks like in a team.
Yeah. So it's basically, when I think of team, I think of people that are thought partners on joint work. So 2 or more people. When teams grow bigger, things tend to break down and we wind up making smaller teams out of them. And so what does bigger mean? I think when there's, maybe when you get to like 10 people, 13 people, there tends to be a splitting of teams. Communication tends to flow better when you have smaller groups of people together. That being said, I also have experience with larger teams that have the freedom and flexibility to work in smaller kind of sub teams together. So yeah, it's really people working together on joint work. But then people might call themselves a team when they're really a group working in parallel on completely different things, but they gather together and we might call them a team as well, although they're not necessarily working on immediate joint work. So it's a deep term.
Is that joint work sort of critical to success in your view? Like the fact that we both have a lot of like commonality or sharing in terms of what we're thinking about, but also we're putting all of our energy towards the same problem?
I think the joint work aspect is important because it's why we gather together usually to talk with each other. When you have a group that comes together and they're updating each other on what they're doing and the work is very divergent, it might be interesting to some people to hear about what's going on. But when there's almost like a dependency between people in the team to get the work done, or they're working, the motivations are similar. They're working on shared goals. I think it's a bit different. So some people that define teams talk about this sort of interdependent work. There's clear boundaries to the team. Mm-hmm. There's different books related to this. There's a book called Leading Teams by Richard Hackman, not from the software realm, but they talk about like bounded nature of teams and working on interdependent things. And I think, people might get quite pedantic about, oh, is it a group or is it a team? Or they're not a team, they're a group. But, it's like people together working together. They call themselves what they want. But in software development, we might have cross-functional teams, or you might find, some companies still with component-based teams that need to integrate their work together and collaborate across teams. Mm-hmm. There's a wide range. Oh.
Yeah. Well, I think that the kind of motivation and dependency is a big thing in there, right? Like, I exactly as you're describing it, a bunch of people getting together to talk about the completely independent things they're working on always feels a little odd. Maybe that's rolling up to something, and so it's useful at a higher level. But when it's like you and I are working on a thing, and I can't do my part without understanding your part, or maybe we could solve this part together because we're both really deep in it. That's a very, very different dynamic. So I would love to understand your perspective. There's a lot of this discussion of reteaming is about, individuals joining, individuals leaving, and how the team gets redefined at each of those points. And so one thing that's really interesting to me in that is that, individuals have their characteristics, right? Every person is slightly different. And individuals, we always think, bring, oh, this person is really great at that, therefore that's this really natural addition to the team. But then it changes the team, right? It's not just that now I've added this capability, but the whole way that the team interacts changes. And so one of the more interesting realizations we've had maybe in the last, decade or so of engineering is it really is a team sport, mm-hmm. right? And individuals don't necessarily, it's not just a sum of the parts. It's not just, I take these individuals and that makes a great team because they're great in these different ways. So how do you think about, I guess, individual performance versus team performance? And then how do you think about assembling a team, knowing what you know maybe about individuals?
Yeah, so individual performance and team performance, just the question of performance altogether is quite an interesting one. There's a lot of different thoughts on what that means. And it's a word that I think we always need to de-blur and get like really specific about, all right, when we're talking about performance, what do we mean? Does it mean that the company, the software is selling to customers and they're delighted by it, and so the team that produced it is high performing, right? If you're in a startup and nobody's buying your software, people are working really hard and doing all the work, but you're not finding product market fit, let's say, and people aren't buying the software, but you built this elegant, beautiful thing in on time, whatever that means for your organization. Is that mm-hmm. a high performing team or not? Is something missing? I think also when, when organizations get bigger, there's a need to know what's going on. And I think sometimes teams face a lot and people face a lot of scrutiny. How are they doing? The person at the top maybe doesn't know what's going on at the other layers of the company. And so, performance management comes into play. So I think it's a very, like, using the word performing team or high performing team or performance needs to be defined. And I think it's a little bit different at other companies. So I think mm-hmm. there needs to be alignment within companies about what that means. Like, are your people performing? Maybe you have other structures that give definition to this. So individuals, at some companies that reach a certain size, the performance management process will come into play. And managers have a role in this, and people at a regular basis get feedback on how they're doing based on the definition of what it means to be successful in their individual role. So we have competencies. Maybe there's competencies to get better at for each of the different roles that you have. I've seen this become very detailed at some larger companies, or in smaller companies, startups and other things. It can be quite refreshing when we just get together and build software and we don't have to worry about these evaluation frameworks and other things, because we're really tactical. We're trying to survive. We're working together. We're building and we're delivering. So, how are the individual people doing is a very important thing. We are paid individually. I haven't encountered many companies where the salaries are for the combined team. Maybe some incentives are. I think all this ties to compensation as well. It's like this big blob. Usually if you're in a small team and your work is interdependent, and you might notice that someone isn't really doing their part, then discussions happen. And I like a team together. Sometimes if the dynamic is off and they're not working well together, maybe there's other challenges that you notice, like they don't seem to be getting any work done and the delivery is a bit stalled. What's going on there? And I think this whole topic of performance is people want to be scientific about it. People want to be very maybe quantitative about it, or write things down and have qualitative feedback as well. It's something that's very hard to grasp, and I think perception comes into play also. Someone might judge someone else and based on their interactions or what they've heard, a leader might say that this person is not a top performer, and it's not necessarily fair. And people get reviews. And so, coming up with strategies as individuals to go into these situations is important. I would always tell people to always keep a running list of what your accomplishments are and what the outcomes are that you have produced, so you can communicate them to your manager and make sure that you're in charge of your career and the way that you are perceived in the organization. Because your manager might not necessarily know some of the things that you've done. There's something about the visibility of our positive actions that ties into performance.
Well, I think you raising something really interesting in there, which is the kind of disconnect, if we can go that far, between how, performance, as in my performance in the role, how I'm judged, how I'm compensated, all these things, is a little bit disconnected or at odds in some way. There's some tension between that and team performance, which is really what drives the outcome of the organization. I think from a again, in a software engineering organization, the unit of work is really the team, right? The goals are generally aligned around the team. I might play a role in that team, right? But having the team work really well, and a big part of that, as again, referencing some of the stuff that you've written about, putting someone into a team that's a good fit or not a good fit in that team, right? Like putting them in an environment where they're going to succeed. But ultimately, the outcome is tied to the team, but a lot of the measurement and then sort of like mechanics of how we think about structuring organizations is tied to individuals in a weird way. So is there something we need to be focusing on, I guess, as we build teams, where we're thinking about how do these players fit together, right, to form this team? Is this a good fit for this particular person? Are they going to be successful as a part of this overall group, as opposed to just, are they a successful person, right? Like, do they have the capability to be successful? Everyone's got the capability to be successful in the right environment. So how do you think about structuring teams to maximize the performance of the team, given what you know, I guess, about individuals?
Yeah, I always think it's a good idea to include people in the decision making in terms of team composition, getting to know people, what their career trajectory is, what they're looking to do, what their interests are, giving people the opportunity to volunteer into new teams. Let's say you have these 5 existing teams, but you're building a new product and you have some opportunities, and maybe you know the types of roles that you want on the team. You want, some engineers, maybe a designer, a product manager. Making it known inside the company that you're going to be staffing this new team is really important, because then you can get people, then there are giving people the opportunity to say, hey, I'm really interested in this and here's why. You might not have thought to ask that person to join the team. I like that. I like that aspect of including people in team decisions, because I think it just gives the possibility to extend someone's career at a company just by providing opportunities. And you might not always know what someone is interested in growing into. Sometimes we don't have time to do a lot of the career development type activities that we might want to do as managers, for example, because we have strict deadlines, maybe we're understaffed, and it's there's less of that going on, especially too if managers have wider ranges of reports these days. If one manager has 15 people, it's hard to have this supportive career development discussion. You don't want to be in meetings the whole time. You just can't. So I think allowing input to team design can go a long way. Sometimes you need to run fast, and there's different reasons why you form teams. And there's interesting stories. I think you could take it to the extreme. You could just form the teams. You could make it completely open where the people decide who the teams are, but it's like a continuum. So thinking about what's best for the problem you're trying to solve is a place to start.
I think that's a really I know some of the stories because I read the book, but I think people signing up for what really excites them has to be a key factor. And, of course, there's dynamics between individuals, which is another thing for managers to pay attention to and leaders to pay attention to in the structure of teams. But being really bought into the goals and objectives and the problem of a particular team is a huge piece of, I guess, leverage or value as an individual to get to the place where you're going to be doing your best work, right? Like, I like the people I'm working with, and I'm really excited about the thing we're doing. Is a pretty good combination of factors, I think, to get you there. So, a huge part of what you talk about, what you've written about, what you think about is in changing teams. And I think in the world of software, I think probably in just business in general, we love this notion of this more long-term, stable, durable team. And it sounds great, but I think what, the big takeaway for me, and this is, I think, just from the first time I even heard you speak, was this notion that you can't depend on that. There's always a reason that teams are changing, whether you're growing, shrinking, people are just, leaving or coming to, changes in careers, changes in business objectives. And so thinking that this is the exception probably puts you in a path where you don't think very deeply about how to do it well. Whereas if you acknowledge this is inevitable, this is going to happen all the time, then you start to think, okay, how do we design our organization? What kinds of practices do we put in place to actually enable us to do this well? And I'm curious if there was sort of an aha moment for you where you said, wait a second, like, we're looking at this the wrong way. And what was that? Like, what sort of opened your eyes to it? And then I feel like from there, you got a lot of reinforcement saying, yeah, this is actually what happens.
Oh, yeah. I remember when I was at Appfolio, which is property management software as a service company in Santa Barbara. I was the 10th employee there. And from one team to about 25 teams was like my tenure there. And I remember at one point, we were like doubling or tripling in size, and I was partially responsible for onboarding software engineers and helping them be successful, ensuring they had mentors, like which team are they going to be on, like all this stuff, kind of an enablement role slash like coach role.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember like a lot of the books that I would read said, you want to have long-lived stable teams. But for us, it was like, well, we were growing like crazy. And it's like, what, are we doing it wrong? I mean, Appfolio is a very successful publicly traded company on the NASDAQ, I think NASDAQ, and like wildly successful company, very proud of Appfolio. And at one point I was like, wait a minute, we can't really do that because I remember one day we had 20 engineers show up, 20. So, and I couldn't onboard them. We couldn't onboard them the same way that we would, two came one day, one came another day. Like that was a different thing. Like we had to get I got smoothies for everyone. Like we had like an event, got blenders in the grass smoothies. Like we had like a whole thing. And then the mentors came, we facilitated this event because we had to like help them get on board. Like we had to get their computers ready. Like we had to order the stuff like it, and it was like, we got to move the lens over here and not read and listen to kind of like the dogma of you want them stable, but no, we're like growing and like the same with, when your company shrinks, it's another kind of change you really need to manage. And so I just felt like if we went against the grain, so to speak, we would be just distracting people. And we were very methodical with like who went where and all of this. Like there's a lot into that, but you got to read the room where you're at. And like, you take these best practice suggestions with a grain of salt and I mean, we thrived, we grew and we thrived. And yeah, so, I mean, that was like definitely an aha. I think other ahas too were just different stories. Sometimes it can be like organ rejection. Like someone joins a team and they're just not getting along, and you can try different tactics. And, it's clear that I would always we used to call it like taking people's temperature. Like, how are people doing? Like, are they engaged? Are they excited in what they're working on? We want people to come to work every day. And I would have one-on-ones with different engineers throughout the years. And I still do, it's a lot about, how are people feeling and keeping them engaged. And sometimes you need to make a change when it's just not working out, when like the dynamic is off. Mm-hmm. I think things sometimes can turn around, but, it's not about persistent misery. It's about like, sometimes you got to break teams up. I remember one team I worked with over the years, and, I've worked with teams for 25 years or so now. I remember one team, the product manager was afraid of the developers, and like, there was just this funk, and there was mismatched respect. I mean, we had to just kind of bust up that team because it was just, if you have a toxic situation and it's not going to do anyone any good, it's going to be a distraction. We're there to build software, but we're also like working together. These are our lives. And so relationships are really important for all of this. You don't have to be best friends with people, but you have to get along and do work together and maximize your time together. And even in these days where, people are cutting back, there's maybe teams that are getting smaller, layoffs and other things, it's still like super important. And I never want companies to lose sight of like, how are people doing? Are they growing and thriving? I mean, the people are important to our companies.
Yeah, so. I think maybe even more important now. It's not that people are more important, but more important to pay attention to those things. I mean, it's been an exhausting, I'd say 4 years now. I mean, in all different kinds of ups and downs, right? Like it felt like everything was just very steady and we knew what was happening tomorrow. And now it's like, we don't know what crisis is coming next and how things are going to change. And so on top of all that, at least having some stability, I think, in your work, some understanding, hey, this is a thing I'm doing, I'm enjoying it, I'm growing, I love the people I'm working with, to your point of breaking up the sort of more toxic things. I think one really interesting place that you hit on in your discussion of anti-patterns and sort of going back to the individual versus team was this idea that, you could take a team that's high performing and distribute that performance. Like, oh, if we take these people and put them in other teams, we'll get more high performing teams. It totally doesn't work. And I mean, one, I'm interested to hear, the backstory, how you sort of maybe saw that happen. And two, a little bit about why that fails and what we might do in a situation where we have a high performing team and we're trying to get some other teams up to that, to that same level.
Yeah, that was a story from a CTO that I interviewed for the book, John Walker, and he thought, let's spread all this positive, development work and let's spread the people, and like they're doing so great, like let's up level everybody. And so let's take the team members and just distribute them. This gets back to that individual and team stuff, right? Sometimes there's just this, when you get certain people together, even like sports teams, you notice like, oh my God, they're winning all these games. They're doing all this stuff. One person leaves or other people, the whole thing, it starts to become a little different. And he says in the book that, he wound up with like a few average teams, right, and he kind of destroyed that thing that he had, and he'll always remember that. And I think, so people come to me a lot of like, well, this team's doing great. Like, how do I get others to be like that team? And I think that's what John wanted to do as well. And through the years, it's sort of like, how do you build influence and how do you spread these good ideas? And so I think there's different ways, like if you have like a lunch and learn or regular presentations where people can share things that they're doing. Peers influencing peers can go a long way. I remember when I was at Procore Technologies, I was working with a software engineer, and we were helping people estimate and forecast when their work was going to be done, because they had to talk to enterprise customers on a regular basis. And it was like, it can be really stressful if you have to have that conversation directly with the customer. Like, here's where we're at. And like, this is when we're going to be done with this thing that is really important to you. And so we found people that had a problem and helped them solve this problem, which was, how do we forecast when work was going to be done? And created sort of like a pull system for our effort. So we would give training and teach some lean techniques for forecasting when work was going to be done. And then they got up on a stage and shared what they had learned and how some of these tactics had helped them. And then that really fed into our effort to train more teams in some lean agile practices at the time. And I think, it's like when you have an idea and you want it to spread, you find the opinion leaders and you give them airtime, you get them on a stage. Peers influencing peers is a lot stronger than a lot of the times, like someone getting up and saying, this is awesome, do it this way. No, like people can relate to different opinion leaders that are on the development team. And so I think, that's definitely one way. Or other sort of communication campaigns. It's really like internal marketing to share different tactics. You can take the education route, and you can switch pairs. I mean, that's an excellent way. Let's say in that story that we talked about before, where that leader was like, I'm going to break up this team and spread the people to spread the high performance. You could also do something like a nomading program, where you have like a developer exchange, teams that are willing to have a developer come to their team for a couple of weeks and then leave. Maybe they pair program. That's an excellent way to share different tactics and techniques. Some people might also do selective programming in groups, kind of ensemble or mob programming. Those are other ways to share tactics. But again, you always have to help the willing. You can't inflict the good ideas on people. They have to want it. So key is, creating some sort of pull system. And I think it's through all of this, a lot of the key to spreading the practices is definitely getting better at influence.
Yeah, well, I really like the kind of peer modeling one, because it's nice to hear, I think, from your colleagues. But the thing that's coming up for me as you're talking about that is seeing these are people who have problems similar to my problems. Therefore, I believe more what they're telling me about what's worked for them, as opposed to leadership saying, I'm taking the most extreme view, but like, you're broken in this way, and if you just do this thing differently, you'll be better. It's like, well, I think the natural reaction is you don't understand what I have to, go through every day, what I struggle with, etc. Whereas the peer team, like, okay, well, you're operating in the same environment, facing the same challenges, and therefore you are representative of what's possible for me. This is a really weird analogy, but I think the world is really into F1 right now. And one of the things that's interesting about Formula One racing is there's one other person on the track who has exactly the same car as you. And so like within your team, that's actually the person who you're sort of like most likely to compete with, because they have exactly the same toolkit that you have. And so I think there's a little bit of that, right? Like, again, the leader, they could tell me that I need to do something different, or they can make suggestions, but I don't know that they truly understand my context. But a team that's working in the same environment, right? They are seeing all the same things, struggling with the same things. And so, yeah, I like the pair program, but it might actually be attending their stand-up and saying, oh, they talk about these things differently. They share differently, or they have more innovative ideas. Whatever it might be, like figuring out what is it about my team that doesn't work like this team. Guesting, showing up your kind of nomad model would be a really interesting way to go, oh yeah, there's other ways of doing this. Maybe there's something I can take back. We can't just carbon copy this team, but I might take something out of here that will allow me to go back to my team and say, hey, let's try this. Let's see if this helps us, right?
Yeah, I think there's different ways, like definitely by having people visit other teams, and always having that thought that I think all teams have things that they can teach each other. So some teams become legendary, or they get the airtime, or they get the spotlight, or other things, and just not underestimating teams that are maybe quietly working and delivering and adding value, but maybe it's a different kind. And I think that's important too. So, I think, we all have a lot to learn from each other. So how do we focus on learning and upskilling the individuals and the teams is something to do. So.
Yeah, I think that, the thing I love about this anti-pattern, of breaking up the team is really the realization that I don't know if it's the performance. I don't really want to, I'm kind of like shying away from that now, but like the success is in the team. It's not in a collection of individuals, right? And so like the interactions between those people are as important or more important than the people themselves. And figuring out what is it about that dynamic that I can then take and maybe learn some things from. And my context is different. I've got a different group of people over here, but do we, but to your point of wanting it, do we aspire to have the same sort of measure of success that team has? And if we do, what are they doing differently that maybe would help us, or what's unique about us that maybe we need to find our way to unlock it? But I think it really does start with wanting it, and then being curious and going and looking at others. Awesome. Well, unsurprisingly, tons of very interesting insights on teams. I will recap first of all, everyone listening, absolutely read Heidi's book. It's excellent. And I think not just one thing I would add, not just in thinking about this problem of teams, but the foundational elements of then doing the work, right? Of how do I move people around? How do I get people on board? And how do I get people into a great spot? And again, so much of this being about the team and not the individuals, and this realization we're always going through change. So let's prepare ourselves for change. Like, let's be good at doing the change because that's inevitable. And that way we can be good at doing the job. So thank you so much for joining me. Thanks to everyone who's listening. If there's someone in particular you want us to talk to, find us on Twitter at CircleCI or ping me on LinkedIn. And of course, if you enjoyed the podcast, subscribe on your podcast provider of choice. Heidi, again, thank you so much for joining me. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rob.
You bet.